Everybody's had time to get their coffee? Great. Hi, I'm Catharine Rice, and I am a fellow NATOA board member and commissioner on the City of Alexandria IT Commission and the VTOA secretary. But I'm here today for a really interesting panel on making your community digitally inclusive. I think this is where the pedal meets the metal. We have three really terrific speakers, and I'm not going to spend any time talking to you. I'm going to turn it over really quickly. Our first speaker, and what I'll do is give you a little bit of background on each of them, and then David will start things out. Our first speaker is David Keyes. David has directed the City of Seattle's Community Technology Program since 1997. And he was the first community technology planner in the country. David was on the working group for the deployment of the National Digital Inclusion Framework and has served on Washington State Broadband Advisory Boards and a variety of other local and national groups, including the Alliance for Community Media many years ago. At the City of Seattle, his leadership on digital inclusion and broadband adoption has included developing the Technology Indicators Research Project, which you'll probably talk about today, Technology Matching Fund community grant programs, cable broadband for nonprofits, Puget Sound Off online youth civic engagement program, and Get Online campaigns. He serves on the Washington State Access to Justice Board's Technology Committee, Seattle Public Schools Technology Advisory Board, and helps lead the city's Race and Social Justice Initiative Inclusive Public Engagement Committee. Thank you, David. David is also a graduate of Antioch College and the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Affairs. Laura Breeden, to David's left, is the Program Director for Public Computing and Broadband Adoption at the NTIA, and I think you all know who the NTIA is by now. Laura Breeden joined NTIA in May 2009 to lead the public computing and sustainable broadband adoption components of the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, as we all know, BTOP. That was a $4.7 billion with a B competitive grant program that is part of the Recovery Act. Under her leadership, BTOP has awarded more than $452 million for projects to make 21st century computer and internet services more available, affordable, and useful. More than $250 million of these funds support quote-unquote sustainable broadband adoption projects in low-income urban and rural areas throughout the U.S. Since 1983, Ms. Breeden has worked in public, private, and nonprofit sectors to advance the use of modern digital communications for the public good. And Laura holds a BA in Urban Studies and Education from Oberlin College. And finally, Adja. And Adja, I'm just gonna destroy your last name. Gildersleve? Gildersleve, all right. Adja's several years of experience working with community-based organizations. In 2012, Adja received a BA in political science and history from Winona State University and then joined AmeriCorps and completed 2 years of national service. Racial equity is a priority in which she is very passionate. As a digital equity specialist with the City of Minneapolis Information Technology, she has had the opportunity to build strong relationships in North Minneapolis with various organizations and neighborhood associations. Adja is considered an avid leader when it comes to the digital equity movement. And with that, I believe the order we're going to start with is David, who will give us some background on digital inclusion frameworks. Laura is going to talk to us about BTOP and broadband adoption. And then Adja is going to talk to us about the Minneapolis experience, and then we're going to whip around and have David talk to us again about assessments.
Thanks. It's great to be here, and thanks to all of you for the work you do every day in your community so that we can learn from you and share that as well. So I really appreciate it. What I've done has been certainly gleaned from what others have done. So I'm going to spend just a minute talking about a couple frameworks. And let's see if I'm going forward or if the folks in back are. So I just want to mention one of the things that's been out for a number of years now already, but the National Broadband Plan. Within that National Broadband Plan, Section 9 is about adoption and utilization. And it's worth a read. It sets the stage. There were pieces of that have been adopted, a lot of it that hasn't been, including, for instance, the National Digital Literacy Corps. But I think some of these recommendations still really apply as you're working in your own community to think about that framework and as you work on policy locally, regionally, and nationally. So that cost barriers, the relevance barriers, I'm going to do this twisting thing because I don't have it right in front of me. Issues of accessibility in a variety of ways, from the network to folks with disabilities getting access and assistive technology and so forth. And then it also had a recommendation for expanding federal support for regional capacity and regional capacity evaluation. And I think you'll hear some of that from the folks as they talk today as well. So the coming out in part from that National Broadband Plan was a charge to the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences to develop a digital inclusion framework. And so an advisory committee from around the country, led by the ICMA, the International City County Managers Association. I hope I didn't muddle that too much. Huh? And the IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences, and the Technology and Social Change Group at the University of Washington developed this great framework about some of the elements in a digital inclusion plan. And this is the definition, that it's the ability of individuals and groups to access and use information technologies, and then what else it encompasses. So not only the internet, hardware, software, relevant content as a really important element there, and the ability to produce, not just to retrieve information, and the training to use communications technologies effectively. So it's a really good route, I think, also as you're working in your own community to talk about and talk around. And they've got a set of principles and some actions in there. And there's a workbook around it, so it's worth looking up the whole workbook. But just here's those principles around access, including, I want to note, kind of design. So when you open your door in the morning, which is your browser, what does it look like? Where are the public access sites in the community? And then adoption principles of relevance, digital literacy, and consumer safety. As we heard about consumer safety this morning from Verizon as well. And then they've got about 6 or 7 these strategic areas. So many of you are working in it. We've heard some great stuff already at the conference here about some of these areas in education, healthcare, civic engagement, public safety, economic and workforce development, social connections. And I know Tom Camber has talked about the seniors staying connected with each other as one of those examples of that. So that sort of sets a little bit of a framework from what's in the digital inclusion framework from the IMLS, the national framework. So with that, we're going to switch over to Laura, who's going to share some of the experiences and what we've learned from some of the BTOP projects around the country.
Thank you so much, David. How many of you are in communities where you have a digital inclusion program already? Great. And how many of you are in communities where you're trying to convince somebody to help you get one off the ground? Anybody? And how many of you have no idea what we're talking about? Well, I don't like to assume that everyone knows what this is because there's a fair amount of jargon associated with digital inclusion. But basically, we're talking about all the people who, for reasons of poverty or lack of skill or lack of physical dexterity or another disability of some kind, or fear, which turns out to be a huge barrier, people who are not online. And there are a surprising number of people, to many of us, who are not online. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what our agency did to help address some of the barriers and fund the kinds of programs that David and many of you are working on. In fact, how many of you did have BTOP funding for your, okay, so some people here. Just quickly, this was a part of the Recovery Act. It passed in 2009. It was $4.7 billion, part of which Congress took back at one point, so it got to be a little bit less. The great majority of the funds went to build out broadband infrastructure in areas that were unserved and underserved. But there was $450 million reserved for the public computer centers and broadband adoption, and another $350 million or so for broadband mapping. So each state has an office of broadband mapping, and there's a national broadband map, which shows where the infrastructure is and at what speeds and so forth. So as I said earlier, for those of you who were at lunch, we created to date about 112,000 miles of networks and have added more than 650,000 households and provided 20 million hours of training, and thank you to all of you who contributed to any of that. So the map shows households that do not have, or do, it shows rates of household broadband adoption by state. The lightest color, brown, are households that have 62% of households or less adopting. And overall, nationally, the number of households without broadband access is around 72%. So that's gone up a few percentage points since BTOP started, and we like to think that BTOP was part of that. I don't think BTOP could take all the credit because there's been an explosion of interest and visibility in networking and the internet generally. The iPad was introduced in March of 2010, right after we started awarding the BTOP grants. So a lot has happened in the last 4 or 5 years. In the rural areas, access tends to be much more problematic. In urban areas, the density of service and the number of service providers tends to be greater, but there are also large concentrations of low-income people in cities, and that is a group overall that it has lower rates of broadband adoption. NTIA includes a policy office that since 1994 has been doing surveys with the Census Bureau, which is one of our sister agencies, about rates of computer use, access to the internet, and now broadband adoption. So over those 20 years, and you can download any of those reports, they're all available on NTIA's website. The questions have changed, obviously, because the services have changed and the capabilities. And one of the questions that is asked as part of this survey is, if you're not online, why aren't you online? So the blue bar, the longest one, is not about cost or not about not having a computer. It says, it's not relevant, I don't need it. There's nothing on the internet that someone like me would want to use or access. Too expensive is the reason that's given next most frequently from about 28% of people. And then no computer, inadequate, or an inadequate computer is next. And availability is also a concern, but as I said, that tends to be much more problematic for people in rural areas. So don't need it, not interested. What's that about? If you start to unpack that and look at what's really going on in those households where they say they don't need it, one of the things that you find is that people have never experienced it, or they have never, they've never been shown anything that might relate to something that they're interested in. So they don't know what they're missing, in a sense. And I think that was a challenge for all of the broadband adoption projects, because it turns out this is a very intensive, very hands-on, very personal, one-to-one kind of enterprise. It's not like you just get everybody in there, show them how to use the computer and what a browser is, and they're online. One of the things that we did, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but because people were so creative in the field about overcoming these obstacles, we wanted to collect their great ideas. And so we produced this broadband adoption toolkit, which is really a how-to manual that talks about planning, training, outreach, making things more affordable, and deals with very specific populations. So this is available online. It's free. I brought a few copies with me if you'd like to take a look at it, and we should have a raffle, but I didn't prepare for that, so we won't. So it turns out, as I was saying, that closing the gap is about a lot more than buying computers or building out infrastructure or even providing training, because the demand for training is very great. The range of skills that you might encounter in people who are new to the internet is very large. For those of you who heard Tom Camber's presentation, he tells a story about someone who came in for a private lesson with him, and when Tom said, point your mouse at the top of the screen, did this. So it's, to those of us who have sort of been immersed in it for a long time and live with it every day, it seems obvious, and maybe even on a good day it seems intuitive. Not always, but occasionally, but it's not. It's a very big learning curve for people who have not been online. So, and the barriers, when you start to really look under that relevance thing particularly, have a lot to do with fear, embarrassment. People often who are lower income and less educated, and those tend to be overly represented in the group of non-adopters of broadband, have not had good experiences in the formal school system. They may not think of themselves as smart people. They think of computers as being very expensive and very delicate. And there's a lot of fear around exposing themselves, around breaking the computer, making someone angry, having to pay back for something that's very expensive. And you have to, when you're working with people, really dig down into that place where their hesitation is and help them move beyond that, which you generally do by showing them something they can do that's very exciting to them, whether it's connecting with their family, looking for a job, figuring out where the best playgrounds are for them to take their kids to, finding out about couponing online so you can save money, looking for the cheapest gas. So there are lots of things that you can do. One of my favorite stories is from West Virginia, where we had a broadband adoption project that very wisely, I think, decided that they were going to work in rural counties, and there was one institution in every rural county that was a physical structure that everybody felt comfortable with, and that was the fire station, because they knew the fire personnel and the emergency personnel, and they felt very easy going into the fire station. So they set up small computer centers in the fire stations, and the emergency personnel and fire personnel could use them for training. They could use them for reporting into the state on what kinds of activities they had been engaged in. But the centers were also open to people in the community, and they had volunteer trainers in every center. And a farmer came into the center who had, I believe, a 5th grade education, and was very, this was a person who was a successful farmer, had a business on the side doing woodworking, did his own equipment repair, but he was really afraid about the computer. There was a wonderful volunteer who kind of took him by the hand and led him through it, and it turned out one of the things that he was most interested in doing online was finding supplies for his woodworking, because he was interested in different kinds of wood and different materials that he could incorporate and tools. So finding that hook and helping people get pulled into using online services so that the motivation is there and the fear factor is not as huge is a really important piece of this. Another thing that's very important is that adults, and this is true of adult learners generally, so if any of you have taken courses or you're doing things to upgrade your skills, you're motivated because you got to solve a problem. You got to get a certificate in order to get a raise. You got to upgrade your skills in order to stay current with what's going on in your industry. Or there's something else that you want to do. You got to get online to see what your kids are doing in school. Hooking the online training, the training to those kinds of online activities is also critically important. Not the kind of stuff that we could write into federal program guidelines. So I think one of the really smart decisions that we made, unlike the forms that we require you to fill out, was the decision that we made, particularly in broadband adoption, to fund a lot of different models. We didn't really know what was going to work. We knew there would be a lot of different situations out in the country, and so we had programs that worked with immigrants and programs that worked with Latino small businessmen and programs that worked with seniors and people in public housing and families with school-age children and rural and urban and a lot of different kinds of programs, because we really wanted to have a kind of national experiment in this. And finally, broadband adoption is a really high-touch enterprise. So the toolkit is something, as I said, that we developed because we really want to harvest the results of all the good work that people have done. It includes chapters on how to plan, how to design a program, what kinds of curriculum you might think about including and what's available online, how to structure training so that it's comfortable and accessible for people, how to make the whole thing more affordable for people if you're working in a lower income area. And it's got worksheets and tips and is organized by audience and by what problem you're trying to solve. So is it affordability? Is it relevance? Is it an outreach, kind of how are you going to get your message out? Another one of my favorite examples is from Kansas City, where there's a Spanish language radio station, and the way they decided to reach the Latino small business people was through a call-in program on the radio station. So they were broadcasting, it's called The Business Moment, and they were broadcasting in Spanish, and people could call in and they would have experts that would answer questions for them, and that's how they recruited people for the small business and entrepreneurship training that they were doing. So I would encourage you to download it. I'm going to give you, at the end of the presentation, there'll be a whole long list of URLs, and we're making the slides available, I'm sure. So what are a few takeaways and lessons learned? What are some best practices? One is that it's all about partners. The first step in any of this, particularly if you are working with people who are disenfranchised in any way or marginalized, is about trust. And people have to feel comfortable in order to expose themselves and in order to feel like they can try to learn something new. And so we worked through all kinds of organizations, churches, senior citizen centers, libraries, these small business organizations, immigrant groups, and so forth. There's no sort of one-size-fits-all here. It's not like we could set up a website and get people to go there and everybody would be digitally included at the end of that process. So having the stakeholders involved and having people who know what some of the options are, but also really listening hard to the community is a very important piece of this. The programs have to be convenient, accessible, and affordable. Often people whose lives are, who are living in poverty have really high-stress lives, and you need to make sure that you're tuned into their needs for transportation or childcare, or to have classes at a time when they're not at work or when their kids are in school, so they don't have to think about the childcare issue. And sort of getting all that right is very important if you're going to have people come to your classes. And finally, I like to say that all broadband is local. The place where these services are delivered is going to be the local community. It's the school services, the health services, the employment training. And local governments, county governments have a huge role in all of this, which is why we've got 2 cities on this panel in addition to me. So getting that stakeholder community engaged, one of the things I find is that a lot of public officials, probably because everybody they know is online, are really surprised to find out that a third of their constituents might not be online, and that is a real problem for them. So raising the profile of the issue and helping public officials and people who deliver services, the schools, the healthcare organizations, employment and training, people who work with people with disabilities, or organizations who work with people with disabilities, get them involved so that they understand that there's a part of their audience, and it could be a significant part of their audience, that is not going to be able to use the parent portal or the online scheduling system or whatever it is, your innovation that's going to save your organization money and make your government that much more effective, because they don't know how to go online, they don't have a computer, they can't afford broadband access, there's no place in their neighborhood for them to get it. And I think those 2 things are coming together. I think there's a growing awareness among public officials that this is a problem that everybody owns. It's not up to the federal government or the public library to solve it, but that's an education job that we all need to keep working on. And I'll just say briefly, we have funding to continue some of this work. We're going to close out grants and monitor performance, but we're also going to collect best practices and disseminate them because there's been a tremendous amount of knowledge generation as a result of these programs. We're going to bring stakeholders together because that's where things happen. And we're also going to support community broadband leaders and people who are starting programs or implementing programs in every way that we can, because the momentum right now is tremendous, but it's not a foregone conclusion that we're going to keep it going without this kind of effort. So we will be continuing these activities. It's been a real privilege to work on the BTOP program and to work with the kinds of people in communities who care about these issues and who, as the panelists this morning said, are willing to persevere. And these are some resources that I would point you to. There's actually an interesting map that we developed of where the projects are and what kinds of things they're doing. The toolkit is available. We have a website. If you're interested in more data, which I didn't present a lot of, I think Adja is going to talk a little bit about some of the demographics of who's online and who's not online. But there's a lot of research available on the NTI website about that, as I said, going back about 20 years. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions.
All right. Thank you, David and Laura. I am Adja Gildersleve, a digital equity specialist with the City of Minneapolis IT department. There we go. Sweet. I just want to get a show of hands. How many of you guys are actually live in the city of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Twin Cities? Oh, wow, not that very. Minnesota? The Midwest? Out of the Midwest? Wow, you guys are representing. Welcome to our state and our capital city. So within our 2014 digital equity profile, the city of Minneapolis has been really a trailblazing city when it comes to digital inclusion, along with Seattle and Chicago and some other emerging cities when it comes to making society more digitally inclusive. So I wanted to recognize those cities for being champions in doing this kind of work that's really necessary now that we're in this society. So we had the opportunity to be able to conduct a survey. Over the last 3 years, we've collected information that gives us a knowledge about how does the landscape look in Minneapolis in terms of who has access to a computer, to internet, and other things that deal with being involved in the digital society. So our survey, is this too loud? Because I'm a loud talker. Can you hear me? Okay, you guys can let me know. I'm not Minnesota nice. If you can't hear me, just say, I can't hear you, girl. You need to turn up. So within our survey, we found out that 15% of households did not have computers at home with internet. And we saw the greatest divide in neighborhoods such as North Minneapolis and the Phillips community. That's where our data showed us that there are the biggest disparities when it comes to access and digital literacy. And we also found out that, I don't know if you guys can see it very well. Yeah, it looks good. That out of the public access, that there's not enough time in the evening for people to have public access to the internet and a computer. So if you don't have it in your home, you would most likely have to find somewhere to go between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. And if you're somebody that works between 9 and 5, then good luck trying to find an hour somewhere on a computer, because it's just not available publicly. And we found this information, and we found out this is based off of 1,752 computers that are community-based, so that means you can go in and use it free of cost. Also, sorry, I just clicked my computer instead of the thing. There we go. Another thing we found out in a big key point that came out in our survey has to do with race, and it stands out in every aspect of the survey, whether it have to be with neighborhoods that are very segregated, or it just have to be with race alone. The data shows that if you look at the last one, high-level users tend to be mostly white folks, and the non-users tend to be people of color. And you can see that on the last one and throughout the data. And I think it's very important that we talk about this, because here in the Midwest, I don't know, you guys seem to be from all over, so you might have a different story, but here in the Midwest, we seem to not talk about things like this. It's an elephant in the living room. I've been to a lot of digital inclusion conferences and different conferences that deal with social justice and bringing more inclusion to communities, with the word race not even being said once, and that's an issue. Because here in Minnesota, we're seen as progressive. People look at us as a progressive state, and also within the cities, we are seen as very progressive when it comes to different things. And if you have been watching the media or really involved with the media lately and different statistics that have come out, there is a lot of pride in that we are among the best when it comes to education, housing, health, and employment. We have really great numbers in our state as a whole and within our city. However, For people of color, you could say the opposite, the exact opposite. There are disparities. We have one of the largest disparity gaps. Even though we have the best access, we have one of the largest disparity gaps when it comes to access between whites and people of color. Okay? And this is a very big subject, and I don't have a lot of time. So I will welcome some questions, and I know some people are just thinking, okay, where is this going? I'm here for technology and to talk about technology and digital inclusion. But I think if we don't talk about this or mention it, we'd be doing the communities that we serve a great disservice. Because we not only need to look at, oh yeah, there's the divide between technology, there's a digital divide, but we need to look at the root of the problem. Why is there a divide? And so that's why I think it's very important to talk about why is it that people of color in Minnesota are more likely to live in poverty, less likely to graduate from high school, less likely to own their own home, more likely to suffer from chronic illness, more likely to be underemployed or unemployed, and less likely to be a part of the digital society. Okay, so what is the root of the digital divide? Okay, and when in this work that I do, I've seen it because I've done direct service. I was an AmeriCorps member last year with the city, and I've worked directly with communities and seen the disparities firsthand. And a lot of what I see along working directly with people and along with the statistics that match what has been seen on the ground is that these numbers are disproportionate, very disproportionate. Okay, for an example, there are more black men in prison today than there were enslaved at a time. So what that means is it something that's individual, or is it something that's institutional, systemic, something within our institutions, or something that's in our systems in Minnesota? And so the dominant model of thinking is usually, it's an individual thing, obviously. Like if you try hard, if you succeed, you can do well. However, there's data and analysis, even within our data when we talk about technology, when we talk about health, when we talk about employment, there are disparities that are widespread and that produce a great degree, and are produced by policies, even though we might not intend as an intent, they just happen to be within our policies, within our programs, and within our practices. And this does not negate the individual's effort, but the existence of racial inequities are embedded in these programs and practices. It means that there are significant barriers that exist to achieving the same level of outcomes across racial groups, even with the same level of effort. So what that means is, yeah, we can get people technology access and literacy, but if they're not on the same playing field with those tools, then where are they gonna go? Because the playing field has to be working as well along with the individual effort, okay? And so in order for digital equity to be effective, we need to have collective impact in the sectors of government, private and public sector, so like libraries and public access community technology centers and community-based organizations. We need to be working together, and we need to be on the same page about what is the root of the problem, okay, and what are some effective strategies, because we have a lot of money here in Minnesota that's dedicated to eliminating disparities, but we have not seen, our data has showed that we are not making big improvements or a lot of changes. So what is it that we need to look at to change and to work together as a collective, whether it be in health, education, or the economic aspect? We need to all be on the same page, working together to really bring equity at all levels to our city. Okay, so what is the role as a city at a municipal level? And within our city, our Mayor Betsy Hodges, and our city council, they ran their campaigns on equity, on racial equity, on equity in general. They have now expressed that we can no longer leave it up to the private sector, and we can no longer leave it up to the public sector. We as government, as leadership, must take a big role in bringing equity to our city, because if we don't have equity for our city, then we will not flourish as a city, and we will not sustain being great in those areas that I have mentioned before. And so what, as a digital equity specialist in the IT department for the city, we have the opportunity to really look citywide and see where the gaps are, use our data as a starting point, and say, okay, these are where the disparities exist, and we can go in those areas and find out more information from the community by building relationships within the community and gaining back that trust with government and the community, and being able to initiate direct service and learn lessons from the community at the same time. No matter what department you're in, what you're doing, you should always be thinking about how can your work eliminate disparities, whether in mostly racial disparities, because the data will tell you, even when you limit it down to income, there's still racial disparities within that. So how can you be working towards that within the line of work that you're doing? And moving the needle to achieve digital equity as a whole. Okay. And so our overall strategy is, David mentioned this as well, we used a lot of Seattle's framework when we first started out. They were champion in this movement and had a great framework to get us started out on how can we strategize now that we have data. So we saw that, okay, people need access, of course. You can't do much if you don't have access. And you need to, after having access, you need to have the digital literacy skills to be able to navigate around that access to use it efficiently. And you must see a value in it, as Laura was saying. The biggest thing is people think they don't need it. And we are in a digital society, so yes, you will need it, and you do need it. And so getting people to see that value and how technology can make their lives better. And so our tactics, what we've done so far is, and what we're working towards, is making sure that there's internet, affordable internet, low-cost internet within public housing buildings and trainings that happen within those, starting there somewhere within public housing, building relationships with the community, organizations who are already doing similar work and helping them fill in the gaps, having business partnerships. We want to have more corporate sponsorships. We'd like to see more businesses that throw away their computers, donate it to organizations, businesses like PCs for People, who take computers from businesses who are going to pay to get them thrown away, refurbish them, and put them back in the community at donation-based cost. We're also offering, we have an AmeriCorps member, and so we're able to offer direct service within the communities. So that member is teaching classes and running our programs in terms of if we have money to be able to get computers in the homes of people, and also they can get the training to go along with that. Then we have the TLC, the Technology Literacy Collaborative, which is a metro-wide group that meets and tries to have all the information that's available in terms of where's public access, where a class is happening. So we want to have a robust technology asset system so that if you're a person that comes to our city, you can go to a website and find out within where your radius where you can get to a computer or get to a class. And then storytelling, capturing people's stories, so people who have been through programs where they were able to have receive digital literacy and then have a computer. How did that affect your life? And can you share that with other people so that they see a value in what you've been through? And then also job development and workforce planning and financial management. We've partnered with Build Wealth Minnesota, which is an organization that works with communities of color to learn how to budget, manage their financial systems. And also at the Workforce Center, we have a relationship with the Workforce Center to make sure that we are offering digital literacy at each center. How am I doing on time? Okay, thank you. One minute? All right, I'll try to do it fast. Okay, so to scale up the impact, we would like to achieve we want to have a collective impact, so we want to see people within we want to work with the health department, we want to work within education to just, like I said before, to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of moving in terms of moving equity overall forward. Okay, so how can we help each other to really achieve equity, because we can't each do it alone. Okay, if you don't have education, then you don't have economic benefits. If you don't have economic benefits, you don't have health benefits. So how can we all work together to really keep the dial moving? Concentrate on internet access at home, simplify technology, and concentrate on how people can take advantage of the internet, because we see a lot of people get PCs and then they will have it for a week and think it's broken, when it's really something simple that needs, where they could just turn the computer off and back on and it'll be fine again. So like making sure that people can use the technology that they have. And we want to ramp up our programs we were able to supply 40 families with a computer this year, and we want to ramp that up to eventually to 1,000 families per year. We want to build stronger connections and collaborations within the community, because as government, we can be facilitators and see the whole city wide, but we also need to be on the ground and know what's going on with other communities on the ground who are working directly with their residents. And we need to build a more robust citywide public technology asset locator system, like I said before. And, in order to have a digital inclusive society that's sustainable, we need to have these things: racial equity, as I've mentioned before. We need to have readily available help, so if people's computer breaks down, they can feel like they have somewhere to go to get it fixed that's affordable. Feeling safe online and feeling safe in general, and having the knowledge to protect themselves. Some ability to troubleshoot, so making sure that if we're building literacy, that people have critical thinking skills to be able to troubleshoot or find out how to solve problems on their own. Simplifying the technology, strong value proposition, and tying technology skills together with job development, financial management, personal goals, and health, and all the other aspects that I talked about. So we've accomplished, the city is able through our, we lease our computers with Unisys, and we're able to donate our computers to PCs for People, and we've donated over 1,600 computers to PCs for People since 2009 that have gone back to residents within the city. We have a digital literacy collaborative, like I talk about, who developed that asset system and leadership within the digital inclusion world. So we have different meetups and events talking about how can we bring digital inclusion to our city and to different specific areas. I'm not gonna go through all of this, but I think we accomplished a lot. We're hoping, like I said, we're hoping to expand our digital equity program so that we can get more families access in the home, because as we've seen in the data, that public access is just not enough, and people need to have that access at home. And I think that's it. I'm really looking forward to your questions. I would love to give out my card, and if you guys have any questions, not here today, or you want to send me an email, I'm really open to that. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
By the way, what a wonderful example of AmeriCorps and what it does for people, huh? Or what it brings to us.
Great. Thanks, Adja. So I'm going to do a couple structural things and some tips. Another kind of one moment on equality versus equity. The greatest example I can always think of is the lines outside of bathrooms when you go to the theater. So the difference is where you need to actually invest to adjust for those differences. So not having the equal number of stalls, but an equitable number of stalls, if you will. So we've talked a little bit about individuals. I also want to just mention, as we're thinking about our digital inclusion strategies, that includes families, thinking about access for small businesses and nonprofit organizations. They need the capacity to use the internet effectively, and the support to do it. Thinking about neighborhood communication systems and cultural organizations and the role they play as well in that ecosystem. And then proximity to tech support, and mentoring. I'll talk a little bit more about planning and development, but are our tech sector hubs and our transit-oriented development projects connecting to digital inclusion projects and vice versa. And one quick example of some effort that just happened this last weekend was a hackathon startup weekend in Seattle for Hack the Central District, not the compact disc, where we had basically a neighborhood entrepreneurial jam in the African American community particularly, bringing together a wide range of folks to do a 54-hour hackathon to have kids and adults, folks from a variety of folks, create new products and get exposure to the tech sector and think about how companies can invest in those neighborhoods. A couple of the projects that they came up with, a couple of the winners were PolitiCheck to track politicians from promises to action when they get into office. Probably the most valuable one would be Pup Alert, so people can find their lost dogs quickly. And Africa Town, a concierge service to connect customers to African American businesses. Just a few examples. If you do a search for Hack the CD, you can see some more great ones that they came up with. So a little bit about data. Laura mentioned that there's some questions in the census now. And I do want to mention this because it is worth looking at. It's something that you can retrieve local data and something that you should be using. And you can also tie that to other indicators and measures that are being used in your area for community planning in general. So something is just to make others aware of that information already exists to some extent. Now we've also done a larger set of what we call our technology indicators or technology access and adoption project that we've done since the year 2000. So we've done it about every 4 years. We've worked closely with, part of the team is working with Tony Perez, who's our cable officer, with our government channel, with our web team, with the mayor and council to see what questions they want, to come up with a set of questions. We also worked with our advisory board to say what values and do you have that you want to look at measures on. And so, actually, can you hand me that for a second? I'm going to talk about this a little bit, but and what's in there, but I also want to just sort of point out in terms of sharing the data, we worked really closely with community groups to do focus groups. And we also made a point on our website of putting up high where the non-English translations of some of those materials are so that people can access them easily so that we can also have those discussions and use the data in those communities. This is sort of what the actual report looks like. And I have some copies over on the piano there. So as the contest, you can go ahead and play a little ditty on the piano and pick up one of the copies of the report. No, just help yourself if you want as you go. So some of the topics in the indicators, I'm not going to talk a lot about the data, but it includes things about access in a variety of ways. We asked about super high-speed internet services, trying to get at how much interest was there in fiber, particularly, which was quite an interesting sort of to see that interest across different sectors. Uses of skills, including social media. Are people using Facebook and Twitter? Are they using it often? Particularly large gap there for age and a number of other things. A number of questions about cable services that will go in and be used as part of our refranchising process, the channel and the website. Civic participation, we asked about how do people want to give their opinion to government, how do they want to ask questions of government, and how do they want to get urgent alerts. So we can start to look at that by demographic and by interest in different communities. So we did a phone survey, and we did it 3 ways. So we did a phone survey. We did 20% by cell this time. Really a big challenge in the data collection for anybody that's done that, of getting people who don't have landlines. We did an online survey, and then we did 9 focus groups in 6 different languages, and including a really interesting disabilities focus group with a range of disabilities. So just having that conversation, one of the things that we heard a lot was just thank you for coming out and talking about this together. We also used a mutual interviewing technique where people interviewed each other and then reported back to us. And we worked with translators to do that. We actually contracted with community organizations to help us do that and to help translate. So a really valuable process, interesting process. Seeing an elderly Somali woman talking to a young kid about what Facebook was is just precious. It's great. Seeing them also help each other, getting data from an elderly person who has very low literacy, doesn't speak English, but cares about what's going on with her kids and in her community. So we did find, in this parallels certainly some of what Adja is talking about, differences by particularly education and age, by other factors, including language, disability is striking, and so on. So certainly still some significant gaps, and it's important to sort of drill down into different areas to see that, but also some places where things are closing, like the adoption of social media by the African American community, for instance. An important thing is to see what we can do as we're getting information out. But some interesting things, I think, just in terms of also looking at method, this is just who owns what between the results we got from our phone survey online and the focus groups. So from those underrepresented groups, that snapshot really shows that there was significantly less numbers of folks. So as you look at things like Pew data and other things, they're not including some of these limited English-speaking communities, for instance. So an important piece, you know, the phone data is the most statistically significant data. The other two pieces are biased data between the focus groups and the online survey, but they're important snapshots for us to work with and others. We also found, maybe not surprisingly, so lower income residents have lower speed broadband service. And this is just the comparison by income of who has DSL versus cable, which is the majority of folks. But you can just see the scale up by income on the right-hand side, which is cable there. And then we look at, so are people using the internet? So as we think about, again, that access, skills, and content. And so we did see significant differences in how people are using the internet. You know, so an interesting thing, we found that, you know, certainly Caucasians are looking for health information more online than others. So there's a number of kind of uses of the internet. African Americans had a lower comfort with adding an app to a smartphone. An interesting piece was about 6% of folks in Seattle have smartphone-only access as their own internet. So one of the things we're starting to see is this difference in opportunity cost in who has multiple devices, who has it that they can go shopping when they're out someplace, or can a blind person find their way by using a smartphone when the bus drops them off in the wrong place. So we start to think about those multiple devices that some of us are carrying around already, and that impact in use. There were still about a third of people using email who were not comfortable with attachments. So as you're sending out those PDF files, you have to think about that. So a couple things that we've negotiated for in our cable agreement, and I think in general to think as you're working on agreements and partnerships, in large part thanks to Tony, we have really strong consumer protection in our cable agreement. You know, and consideration for folks as they come up is does that consumer protection, can you negotiate for an extension of that to internet? One of the things that we heard quite a lot was a lot of confusion about pricing schemes. I mean, if there was going to be a national thing, I think clarity in pricing is certainly an important piece of that. Right now we have some discounts for cable. Again, that challenge, trying to get discounts for low-income folks, and we can talk a lot more about that. We have an arrangement with our cable companies for free internet for community sites, providing technology access. We've got all together, between a couple franchises, we've got over 300 sites in Seattle that are getting free internet as a result of that. That is money that those social service agencies can spend on paying staff to deliver services instead of having to pay internet. So it's a direct return to the city and the community as a result of that. And a great partnership with the cable companies that were able to do that. That was part of a side agreement to the franchise. but we also started that as a demonstration project for broadband. We also get some funds for public access computing centers and an online youth civic engagement project called Puget Sound Off. Worth checking out. Youth creating media, learning how to post neighborhood and community information and issues online. They did a piece this year on what should the city look for when it hires its new police chief. And the mayor's office ended up posting the video of what they found from the kids, of their requirements for the police chief on the mayor's website. So, very cool engagement project from them. And that's a partnership we do with the YMCA. Our Get Online Seattle, as we look at broadband adoption, we've started to steer, how do we steer people to the public access computing centers and market that? How do we also help people with relevance? And I think that is, people have mentioned that really well. We've been doing this Get Online campaign around different topics. So we've done health, jobs, we have one coming up on education. So for instance, we partnered with somebody from one of the local hospitals that does social media for them to help give us tips on how to evaluate a health website. So that piece of material goes alongside where the public access centers are and how to get information about the discounts that the cable companies and other provide for low-income folks like Internet Essentials. We also have our Technology Matching Fund grant program that we've been running for 17 years now that does, as Laura said, gives to a real broad diversity of folks. So there's a real value in that. Council really loves it. And we do also partner with a computer refurbisher, kind of our extended learning, so that some families can get laptops or computers to be able to use to extend their learning at home. I think it is important to think about that ecosystem of equipment, training, but also how you're bringing people into a tech support community as well, and a learning support community. So just sort of a couple, kind of to start to head towards the end here, a couple things that we've learned to think about in terms of approaches. You know, I think it's my job to not only be at our own table, but to be at other people's tables, and to identify kind of who is it that we can potentially work with. And so just starting to name that out. I mean, the legal system's been a really interesting one. You know, so we did one of the BTOP projects we worked on was to put public computers in some courthouses and to do video conferencing from there as well in other parts of Washington State. So it's important to just examine who's at the table and what table you're at. A few other things, I think as we've been able to over the years get get PEG channels, you know, we've been able to have some side agreements. We have things like this cable broadband connections, but just the general concept of thinking about reinvesting technology and telecom revenue back into community. So that reinvestment in related purposes strategy has been one that's held really well for us. I know California does a project, their Teleconnect Fund, that takes revenue from cell towers on state-owned land. In Illinois, I know they had a project that would let people sign off on their bill. So to think about broadly as we keep moving forward, how do we do that reinvestment in community and demonstrate that partnership? Instead of just a cable advisory board, we have a technology advisory board. We've done a state council on digital inclusion, so thinking about kind of that expanded piece with a variety of folks. Probably just having some designated staff. I mean, I've been honored that I get to have this job, but just having somebody like Adja, somebody in your department, even if it's not a full-time person, who is responsible for thinking about digital inclusion. Working across departments. So a lot of my work is how do our human services programs think about using the tech labs that we support for youth violence prevention, as a for instance. So a lot of work there. Adja mentioned mapping community assets, really important, that sort of public map. Supporting networks of practitioners who don't always know each other. We do some work, and the BTOP project has done some great work on collecting some of the materials and curriculum that's been used. Digitallearn.org is another site that has some of that, but bringing those practitioners together. And also just want to kind of mention, data does take money in training. So to do this data collection, to get info from our grantees and the public computing centers, from our city sites, it's a lot of work to collect data. And so we have to figure out how to pay for that. It does cost money. And as somebody from the Department of Eds once said, no data, no dollars. And somebody in the audience said, no dollars, no data. But it also takes training for how do you use that data and how do people on the front lines use that data. And lastly in that, we've done a lot of work with really using trusted community liaisons and building those relationships and working with others in the city and community who have those relationships to help foster broadband adoption. So lastly, I just want to mention a couple sort of policy opportunities here and thinking about infusing it. I've talked about some of the laws and cable and telecom agreements is one thing. The comprehensive plans that every city does, and the planning and development and land use folks, is an important construct, I think, to start to create frameworks that you can refer to as you do your digital inclusion. So we're working now on language on that around building out, around accessibility, around conduits into public housing buildings, thinking about other places in the comp plan to create that framework. In Washington State, we passed a law that defines digital inclusion and community technology into state law. So it's something we can refer back to or look at funding from departments and refer back to. There's a goal there. Trying to fold digital inclusion into budget goals. We know that's how things get done, as the budgets and materials. We've done a lot of work connecting it to our race and social justice initiative, public safety and emergency prep, each of our public access centers, and certainly as they found in Katrina and in some other things, those public computing learning centers are critical points also for emergency information and emergency preparedness. And then just looking at your executive or legislative department strategic plans and initiatives across departments and ways to fold in those goals so that when you're ready to implement a program and do that work, there's a basis for that is helpful. And lastly, as we try and infuse our current technology, this was the question in 1905 from the Virginia Dispatch about whether electricity would be as pronounced as it is. Thank you.
I apologize. We have 5 minutes scheduled for questions. We're willing to go over if you guys are willing to delay your drinks. But we have an enormous resource here. Let's take some time and just ask them some questions. You've got them here. Does anyone in the audience have any questions for these wonderful folks? Yes? How has the smartphone affected internet access? Especially among low-income people. And if you can talk close to the microphone so the folks in the back can hear you.
So a lot of work has been done on this, and I would refer you to John Horrigan in particular. He's been working on, he was at the Pew Project on the Internet and American Society for a long time, and but what you see is that people do use the smartphone to access the internet, but they may not use it to do more than a few functions. And it's not very satisfactory for applying for a job or applying to college or filling out your unemployment insurance forms. And so while it's important, I think, and it's particularly important if that's all you have, and there is a segment, I'm sorry I don't have these figures in my head, but if you Google John Horrigan, you will be able to find out a lot about it. So it's an important platform, but it isn't going to solve the problem.
Yes, back here. So can you comment on the Comcast Internet Essentials program and whether this relates or doesn't relate to the problem at hand?
We do have it here.
Yeah.
Adja?
Well, I can't tell you too much about it because I don't know the exact details, but I think you have to check. You have to have a student with free or reduced lunch or meet some of their standards in order to get that access. David, do you know more about that?
Yeah, I think, and there's, in some communities, in places where there are some of the, like CenturyLink as part of their agreement with Quest had to offer also a low-income discount program. So I think it's been a great asset to get some folks connected. I think there have also been significant challenges with it. So it's both the limitation in terms of that program being only for folks with kids in school who are lunch eligible. There's also been a challenge from folks who are trying to facilitate people using that, and a question of sort of trust, understanding what it actually is, understanding the sign up for it. There's actually some recommendations in that some folks have filed to the FCC on the Comcast Time Warner franchise agreement, on the merger, sorry, the Comcast Time Warner merger, about some improvements that they would recommend. This question about expansion to a broader set of low-income folks, seniors, those with disabilities, and some improvements. The California Emerging Technology Fund, which is CETFUND, CETfund.org, and I'll add this to my slideshow, but they have they've put up some of the comments and some stuff that's, I think, worth reading and looking at. So both been a real benefit and some challenges also.
Yes, Mary Beth? Oh, okay, go ahead, Mary Beth. So the question is, for those of us who don't have the dedicated resources, Adja, can you talk a little bit about your transition from AmeriCorps and how can we take advantage of programs like that to make them more permanent in our communities?
So I think a lot of that comes from leadership. So within our city in Minneapolis, our mayor and our city council have really invested in equity, and having technology is a huge part of all the different aspects of equity. And so in order for a position to be created, we have to have that, departments have to have that approved by the city council and the mayor ultimately. And so if you can get leadership on board, you can have those created within departments. If you can get the department heads in seeing a value in this type of work, that's where it really comes from. That they have to see a value in it to even start anywhere.
With the microphone? Oh, go ahead.
I'll just add a really quick side note. I think that combination of using volunteers, having this sort of advisory board role to help point it out, making that connection. So getting in whatever you can to start to show something and collect the data, and then where you can put that into kind of tweak it together in proposals. I know Rondella Hawkins has just been working a lot in Austin on trying to develop that over years too. So.
So Rondella's been able to get a position for those in the back who couldn't hear. Yes, sure. Microphone on the questions.
Can I just add one thing?
Yes,
I want to underscore how important it is to have city leadership invested in this. I was on the phone just before coming here with somebody in a city that I won't name, and we were talking about why didn't things take off there? Because they have some great infrastructure and some great people and a long history with various inclusion efforts. And he said, really the leadership of the city has never come together on this. And if you look at Philadelphia, Boston, Seattle, New York, Minneapolis, those are all places where the leadership has, and I mean in the case of Seattle for many years, but that kind of visibility is tremendously important, and that's how you get to the place where you're going to have somebody who has it in the job description to pay attention to this. I think in the interim, working with organizations that have an investment in equity or an investment in access. The public library is a great resource there. But I think if you can invest in getting the leadership on board, then you're 80% of the way there.
At the microphone, sorry.
The information that you have about the city of Minneapolis, 25,000 households that were not using the internet, do you know how many households were 55 and older exclusively, or how many households had a disabled person in it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually have the book right here, and it's very detailed, and we also have it available online. It might take me a second I can get back to you on that. And whoever wants to know, please go to our website to see the full details. But I think, I can't give you an answer without looking through the data, so let me get back to you on that one.
Microphone, Rick?
I was thinking about Adja's point about racial disparities and wondering about the practical implications and whether the NTIA toolkit includes racial and ethnic groups among the specific populations treated, or whether it should.
Yes, the toolkit addresses particular populations because, as I said in my remarks, it's a very specific, very individual, high-touch kind of problem. So, and trust is fundamental to helping these things happen. And often trust is much easier to establish with somebody who looks like you, is in your demographic, et cetera. So yeah, there are specific examples in here. We could certainly do more with this, and I'm hoping that we will sort of do a updated yearbook for 2014 to add some of that. But the content sites for particular ethnic groups or age groups or language groups, I think, are tremendously important. So that's something very concrete that you can.
Yes, go ahead.
Just I was wondering, could you comment just briefly on the prospects of Universal Service Fund reform in addressing any of these issues?
Universal Service Fund. Closing the digital divide.
Well, the Universal Service Fund has a long history, and as a result, it has a lot of stakeholders that are very invested in how the Universal Service Funds are allocated, and any sort of change in the formula is sort of difficult for people to get their heads around if they are one of the vested stakeholders. That said, I think that the commission is very aware that there are certain aspects of it that are really out of date, and so they've been experimenting with the Lifeline program, for example. And I think that is really of interest because that's a subsidy that can go directly to low-income people who would not be able to afford service otherwise. I don't know how that's going to play out. On the E-rate side, which has been tremendously important for schools and libraries, there's been some movement to allow people who are, or organizations that are not schools, to use the school facilities and the school connection after hours, which I think makes a tremendous amount of sense. That's a very complicated program in the way it's implemented and so forth. And another sort of complication in all of this is that the funds generally go back to what are called eligible telecommunications carriers, which means the phone companies. So the funds don't go to set up computer centers or training programs or to provide one-on-one assistance. Typically, they go to reduce the cost to an individual or an institution. Obviously, cost is a factor, but it's not the only factor. So if you're talking about equity and how to close some of these gaps, it's not just about a cheaper wireless plan or a cheaper phone or the school paying less for its internet service.
We're out of time. Thank you, everybody. Thank our speakers today. It's tremendous. Keep the conversation going.